we know that you're cooler than we are, but we will enjoy your comments later on. It's a great treat to have Luke and Ewen here. The Guardian Fellowship scheme has been going on at Nuffield for very many years, certainly much longer than I've been involved. But David Butler will be able to remember when it began, we'll be able to ask him. But a long, long time. We're delighted to have some representatives of the Guardian of today here with us this evening, as well as Luke and Ewen. I think this is unusual in that normally the Guardian Fellows have not been members of the Guardian staff, but in this particular case, two better looking and more appropriate people
Come on. What a charmer.
could not be found. So in Luke, foreign correspondent, Ewen, defence and intelligence correspondent. It's a great title, isn't it? Defence and intelligence correspondent, and could not be more appropriate. It's been wonderful to have them around. The idea behind the Guardian Fellowship has always been that we would try to get wisdom from the media community and engage them with academics we're up to.
It's the NSA.
One would imagine that the technology could work without the interference, but it clearly can't. So it's been great fun for us to have Luke and Ewen here this year. When Lord Nuffield set this place up many, many years ago, one of his objectives was to encourage cooperation between academic and non-academic persons as we seek to tackle social, economic and political problems. And there isn't at least a higher profile set of social, political and economic problems than those which are associated with the areas that Luke and Ewen have been working on this year. It is a double act. We've had two of them this year. We're going to begin, I think, with Ewen, half an hour from Ewen, and that will be perfectly timed because journalists are good at that. Then half an hour from Luke, and then it's our turn. Ewen.
Myself and Luke, in a fantastic piece of teamwork, have got different sets of slides, and they're not compatible. So there might be a few glitches as we go along. But we'll worry about that later. We first came here more than a year ago, and when we gave the first talk in this room, the Snowden story was still fairly toxic, and views were pretty polarised. And at the end of the talk, we started a Q&A. And one of the first questions was from a professor, Professor Anthony Glees. And he's not from Oxford, he's from the University of Buckingham. And he's not particularly sympathetic to the Guardian. And he certainly wasn't sympathetic towards me and Luke. So his opening question was, why aren't you in jail? And it went downhill from there. In a very non-academic exchange, Luke continued the conversation outside in that courtyard. And as a Glaswegian, I couldn't resist the fight and joined in. But that was the exception at Oxford. Over the last year, we've been treated with lots of civility and politeness. I'd like to thank Andrew for being generous. I'd like to thank Justin Crump, who organised this event. I'd like to thank Gwilym from the Oxford Intelligence Unit at the back there. And I'm glad to see that Kath's here as the new Guardian editor. The Oxford Intelligence Unit, for people who don't know it, it's a member of, some of the members are former senior members of the intelligence community, and some are current. I've never quite worked out who's who. And we've engaged with them over dinner in this room. On one notable occasion, I went with a former senior member of GCHQ to the Bear in Oxford, had a few pints, and that was a turning point for me. I started to view GCHQ differently after that. it was very civil. Despite the civility, I doubt if any members of the Oxford Intelligence Unit agreed with anything either myself or Luke had to say. I don't think it was a meeting of minds, but we'll maybe find out in the question and answer session afterwards. I'll just go quickly recap over 2 minutes the Snowden story, because there's always the assumption that everybody here knows it. The Guardian sent myself, another Guardian, a Guardian columnist, Greenwald, and Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, to Hong Kong to meet someone who said they were going to leak documents. That was Edward Snowden. He leaked tens of thousands of classified documents to the Guardian, in spite of a lot of government pressure from America and the UK. We published them anyway, and it started this sort of worldwide debate. I was just one member of the Guardian team. It was the weight of the Guardian, the authority of the Guardian, and all the talents that the Guardian was able to bring to this story that gave it such so much drive and had so much impact. And that was down to Alan Rusbridger, who I hope will be here later. But it involved almost loads of people in the Guardian were involved. Kath was in Australia at the time, and she was engaged in a huge controversy with the Australian and Indonesian governments. So this story went all over the place. So this was the personnel that went to Hong Kong. When I've spoken about surveillance and Snowden, I've tended to downplay the role of the UK and apologise and say that although this was a huge story in Germany, in the US, Australia, Latin America, people in Britain basically didn't care. They were apathetic, too fond of James Bond movies. Maybe security is more important to them than privacy. But I think that overstated it. I think there actually has been changes in the UK in attitudes, especially over the last year. One of the big, this is a GCHQ, if there's anybody who doesn't know. When we started this story, they had one press officer who very seldom dealt with the national press. That one press officer mainly dealt with the local paper in Cheltenham, community news. So when someone from The Guardian phoned up and wanted a response to Snowden, the response was, sod off. We don't exist, or we're not speaking to you. No comment. And sometimes it was abusive. I was in New York at the time, so I wasn't on the receiving end of this, but some of my colleagues were. Since then, GCHQ has expanded its press team. There's so many press officers at GCHQ now, I can't even keep up with them. I don't know how many there are or all their names. They've decided it's time to engage. They feel a need to engage with the media, a need to engage with the public. So that's a huge change. And then a really dramatic move that would seem almost inconceivable at the time. I was invited with some Guardian colleagues to GCHQ just a month ago for a briefing. The other change is in public attitudes. The intelligence services say to me, people in Britain trust the intelligence agencies. And I think that's basically true. But there has been scepticism creeping in as a result of Snowden. Banksy's one example, but you get lots of others. It's anecdotal. People make jokes about their smartphones, or they make you hear jokes about is the government watching you. So it's definitely there's changes taking place. In the US this week, the Defence Secretary Ash Carter was giving a lecture to students at Harvard. And he acknowledged, he calls it, because of the Snowden thing, there's an element of distrust. He was talking about public distrust, but mainly about the distrust between the internet companies and the NSA and GCHQ. So that's had an impact too. And another big change is in the relationship, the way the press has dealt with Snowden. When we first did this story, the rest of the press basically ignored it. The Telegraph, the Times, the tabloids, and even the BBC. I've never had a satisfactory explanation of why this happened. One of the big stories we did was about Tempora. It was a surveillance program that basically sucks up all the internet communications. And this was on June 22nd, front page of The Guardian, 2013. If you look at the Times the same day, no mention of Tempora. And even though it's the same day, newspapers can overnight pick up each other's stories if they think it's important. But there's no mention of Tempora or any of the other Snowden stories. If you move on 2 years, this was the front of the Times about a month ago. And inside there are 6 pages. For your eyes only, exclusive access to GCHQ, interviews with the staff. It's a total whitewash. It's no job, totally embarrassing. I wouldn't have wanted to write that. But it's good in it, at least it's out there. You know, there's a level of engagement. You can look at it and argue with it, even if you think it's a crap piece of journalism. And the editor of the Times, in an interview with Press Gazette in the last week or so, acknowledged that if Snowden had come to the Times, he would have run the stories too. He said in a more cautious way, but he acknowledged that at least he would have run the stories. And this amazing quote, and he says, "You find actually you get more access from GCHQ and MI6 than you do from the police. How's about that? I would never have said that a few years ago." I mean, so that's a change in the attitude of the press. Now, this is a really dull part of the lecture. So I just want you to stay with me for 5 minutes on this, because it's another example, maybe the biggest change that's taken place in Britain since Snowden. I was here in December last year. I shared this platform with the former head of GCHQ, Sir David Omand, who I've come to like. He's a very reasonable individual. He's likeable when you talk to him in private, but then when he stands up at this lecture, he becomes a sort of Rottweiler and says in public how bad the Guardian's been and how bad Snowden's been. But despite that, he argued that existing legislation covering surveillance is effective. He says that it's fit for purpose. And I said to him, this existing legislation on surveillance, I've read it twice and I don't understand it. It's written in language that's so convoluted, I defy anybody to understand it. So is it like that because it was a bad piece of draftsmanship? Was it just badly written? It was David Ewen that wrote it, by the way. Or did you deliberately write it like that so that it leaves the GCHQ and the other surveillance agencies free to do whatever they want? So one of the good things about this new proposed bill, which came out last month, is astonishingly clear. And it's a tribute to Snowden. They should call it the Snowden Bill. It sets out for the first time all the powers that GCHQ, it lists all the powers they have, including hacking into computers. So that's a real tribute to Snowden that they've done that. And there's other pluses in it. It gives power, limited powers, but powers to the independent judiciary to have a say over surveillance. And another plus, although it's got a but attached, in the original legislation written by David Ewen, the word privacy doesn't appear once. And the Guardian uses the phrase mass surveillance, and the intelligence agencies hate that. For them, it's not mass surveillance, it's bulk data collection. The argument is that mass surveillance suggests that they read everything, even though that's impossible. The intelligence agencies say, we collect it, but we don't read it. As well, you can argue, the Guardian view is, if you collect it, then that's a breach of privacy. So mass surveillance, bulk data collection, as far as we're concerned, it's the same thing. Now, in the original legislation, RIPA, there's no mention of privacy and there's no mention of bulk data collection. In this bill, which runs to almost 300 pages, and I've read it, and it's totally clear compared to the original legislation, privacy is mentioned 40 times, so that's a plus. Bulk data collection is mentioned 400 times, and that sort of still suggests there's a sort of imbalance in the way the intelligence agencies view this surveillance v privacy debate. Now, it's really hard in the current environment, especially after the Paris attacks, to make a case for against bulk data collection. The argument in intelligence agencies is if you have access to all the communications and someone commits a terrorist attack, then you can go back through all the data. If you have the name of one suspect, you can go through all the data and start to make connections. You can discover who they've been speaking to. You build up the network, and maybe you'll stop another terrorist attack. Maybe you'll be able to make quick arrests. And that's a very seductive argument. But if you look at actual cases, almost every terrorist attack since 9/11, the Boston bombing, Lee Rigby killing in London, Charlie Hebdo attack earlier this year, the Paris killings, the people were known to the intelligence agencies. So that's targeted surveillance would have worked. So it doesn't make the case for bulk data collection at all. After Snowden, Obama set up a review body to look at this issue of bulk data collection v targeted surveillance, and their conclusion was that the bulk data collection of phone records hadn't made the slightest difference to any counter-terrorism operation. That was Obama's review committee in 2013. Since then, something remarkable happened last Saturday. In the summer, Obama signed the Freedom Act. And that came into being last Saturday. It was almost unnoticed. It was The Guardian carried a piece on the US website, but it's barely noticed anywhere else. Last Saturday, the Americans ended the bulk collection of telephone data by the NSA. All that data is now held by the telecom companies, and as it should be. So that's a modest reform, but at least it's a reform. And at the same time, the UK is going in the opposite direction. So it does seem perverse to me that as America ends bulk data collection, we have this bill that enshrines it. There are other objections to this bill. there's no there's no protection for journalists or lawyers or priests or doctors. There's an acceptance that that's privileged communication, but then there's no protection. The legislation says that the surveillance agencies, if they think they have sufficient cause, can go through the search through the communications of journalists and the others. Now, why should we be upset about this? Because there's been lots of abuses by the surveillance agencies down the years, and they're still going on. There's stories on an almost daily basis of abuses. And one of the biggest abuses was at The Guardian, when the government sent the GCHQ two officials into The Guardian to oversee the destruction of Guardian computers. One of those officials occasionally comes to these lectures, and he's a good guy. He's a lovely person, nice sense of humour, nothing sinister about him whatsoever. But the whole incident did so much damage to the UK's reputation overseas, probably more so than anything done by the revelations in Snowden. When I've travelled, other journalists repeatedly raised this. Is it true that the government came into the Guardian offices and oversaw the destruction of Guardian computers? I'm just going to try and play some video. It's only 2 minutes long. It's just to recall that period.
That it was the Prime Minister who instructed Britain's most senior civil servant to tell the Guardian newspaper to destroy a computer which held files from the whistleblower Edward Snowden.
The ceremony that took place in your basement, when the secret ceremony, you all just broke up the hard disks and the laptops, is that right? Is that what everyone?
Yeah, it's harder to smash up a computer than you might think.
The paper, which had other copies of the Snowden files overseas, agreed to take an angle grinder to the computer while the intelligence agents watched.
We had the initial pressure in which the Cabinet Secretary arrived at my office and told me we'd had enough debate on this subject. The state decrees there's been enough debate, we'll stop that, and decided to drill out the hard disks of our computers in order to stop us reporting to London.
In America, the White House spokesman was asked, would Obama ever do such a thing?
It's very difficult to imagine a scenario in which that would be appropriate.
The serious point is this, and it goes back to Spycatcher, that I was completely clear with the Cabinet Secretary that there were copies elsewhere, and that the destruction of these computers was not going to stop reporting.
It was just a public relations exercise in the end.
I wouldn't say that, but I would say it was pointless. Their aim was to stop publication and to have a dialogue of the sort that we were having. And Mr. Robbins' witness statement makes it apparent the reason they didn't go for an injunction was because they felt that we were behaving responsibly. They lost control of the documents the moment they destroyed them in London.
What enrages me about this is not just the damage it did to the UK's reputation overseas. As Alan points out in there, it was a totally irrational act. Alan told them there's no point in destroying these documents. These documents exist in New York, they exist in Rio, they exist in Berlin. Destroying them isn't going to do any good. And they came in and did it anyway. And there's never been any explanation of why. The government have since admitted privately that they think it was a mistake, but they still haven't explained why they did it. Was this to somehow please the Americans, or I mean, what was the thinking behind it? And as a Guardian journalist, I find it offensive that in order to report Snowden, I have to go to New York, to the New York Times office to look at the documents, because the Guardian isn't allowed to hold them. America's got more protections for journalists than the UK, but there's something peculiar and perverse that a Guardian journalist has to go to the New York Times office to report on documents that were given to the Guardian. Most people aren't aware of this, but there's still an ongoing investigation into the Guardian journalists. Myself and Glenn Greenwald and Alan and anyone else connected with this. I've always been sanguine about it. If they put me in jail, then I'll be a martyr for press freedom. Alan is much less sanguine about it. And I mean, some of you won't know that he left the Guardian earlier this year, and he's now the principal at Lady Margaret Hall. And I quite like the idea of Inspector Morse or somebody marching across the lawn of Lady Margaret Hall to question and maybe arrest Alan. Maybe the first principal or warden ever to be arrested at Oxford.
I'm sure.
Or maybe not. If anybody thinks that maybe myself and Alan are Russian spies, this will feed the fantasy. The reason I put this up is Luke is going to speak about Moscow and Russia, and he wanted some kind of link. It's a fairly clumsy one. There is a slight point to this. You saw the destruction of those Guardian computers. The Victoria and Albert Museum decided to put them on display. Guardian colleagues say that you can still go and see them at Victoria and Albert Museum. Alan has a little piece of this. He used to keep it in his top pocket. I don't know if he still does. But we decided when we went to Moscow to see Snowden, and we thought it would be a good keepsake for Snowden to have a piece of this destroyed computer. So we had it framed and took it to him. And his reaction was interesting. As soon as he picked it up, he says, "Have GCHQ put a tracking device on this?" A typical intelligence person, he was suspicious. I'm going to show you some footage. It's only 30 seconds, and it shows Snowden receiving this. It's never been shown in public. It's only been inside the Guardian.
It's for you.
Snowden's been in exile in Moscow for 2.5 years. And one of the contradictory arguments you hear from people like Obama and others is, well, he's done the world a service, or America, and you hear this from the Germans and others, in that he started this debate, and it's a debate that we needed to have, and it's been worthwhile, but he's still a criminal and he should be put in jail. He's not treated as a whistleblower, and if he was to go back to the States, he's probably looking at least 30 years in jail, probably a lifetime in jail, there's discussions with the US Justice Department about some kind of deal. I mean, I think he's probably in Russia for the rest of his life. But one of the arguments is that if he receives enough awards, sort of credibility, if, for instance, he writes pieces, and if he was to write pieces in The Guardian, it would help with credibility. He received an award from the Swedish Parliament, that helped his credibility. If he was to receive an honorary degree from Nuffield, might help, or elsewhere in Europe. If there was a joint, his lawyers, we've spoken about this, McCath and Snowden's lawyers, you could imagine if he applied for a Nobel Prize, he probably wouldn't get it, he's too toxic. If it was an application on behalf of whistleblowers in general, perhaps a combination of Snowden with Daniel Ellsberg, then that's quite attractive. So then the argument goes, he could then fly back to New York and say, I'm a Nobel Prize winner, arrest me. But it's not as simple as that. They'd probably still be put in jail. And it'd be dangerous for him in New York or almost anywhere else in America. There's so many right-wing nutters that regard him as a traitor. It'd be hard for him to walk out into the streets. So maybe the best thing for Snowden would be some sort of deal that would allow him to go to Germany or Scandinavia or Switzerland. I'm not optimistic, but at least it's something that we'll carry on fighting for. Now, just to sum up, you know, the changes that have taken place in Britain in the last 2.5 years, we're having the debate, and that's all down to Snowden. I think this investigatory powers bill is a step forward, but it's still it's still, you know, far from anything that I would remotely like to see. There's plenty, 6 months for people to engage and try and get the MPs to make it a more sort of acceptable bill. I'd like to see more transparency. I would like to see a bigger role for independent judges. I would like to see proper political oversight. The new head of the parliamentary committee, Dominic Grieve, is I think an improvement on Malcolm Rifkin, but the political oversight is still too poor. I'd like to see protection for journalists and lawyers. And I think the onus is still on GCHQ and the intelligence agencies to explain why they need mass surveillance, bulk data collection. And I think that Edward Snowden should be given a home in Western Europe. Thank you.
Is that working? Thank you. What a great speech. I wanted to do some thank yous as well. As well as Nuffield, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Kath, to the Scott Trust, to Alan, and also to Ewen. He's been the most remarkable colleague. I mean, a nice guy. I wrote a book on Snowden called The Snowden Files. It was only possible because of Ewen's generosity and brilliance that we were able to do this. And in fact, actually, you didn't mention this, but it's going to be made into a film. It's been made into a film, which Ewen has seen. Ewen is in it. And it'll amuse you that the character playing Ewen in the film, which is by Oliver Stone, it's called Snowden. It's coming out in May of next year. Says laddie all the time. Isn't that right? And as far as I've never heard you say laddie, Ewen. Is that right? No, anyway, the Hollywood Ewen says laddie. And also, I think probably he won't mind if we reveal it, there's a cameo by Alan as well, playing a journalist. So yeah. Anyway, so this is all going to be in Hollywood soon next year. But so the Snowden Files was my kind of last big project with Ewen. And what I've done as part of the sort of Guardian Research Fellowship is I've written another book. Yeah, called A Very Expensive Poison, which is going to be published in March of next year by The Guardian and by Faber and Faber. And this is another kind of preoccupation. It's kind of a Russian-facing preoccupation. It's a story I've followed for almost 10 years now, ever since I was posted by Alan to Moscow as The Guardian's bureau chief in a kind of the freezing January of 2007. And of course, it's primarily about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, which is almost a decade ago now, but also the killings of other kind of Kremlin critics who've been assassinated, most recently Boris Nemtsov, who was shot dead in February, really outside the gates of the Kremlin, who was a kind of very significant kind of opposition leader, and the war in Ukraine, the war in Syria, and so on. And I think the reason I wrote this book, I mean, apart from the fact that it's the most extraordinary story, is I think it sort of sheds light on where we're at with Russia at a kind of a moment of kind of great complexity in international affairs, with wars on multiple fronts, and very kind of different strategic agendas. And I think the Litvinenko case is interesting because it also sort of sheds light on the kind of ideas and the kind of ethics, if you like, which underlie the Putin regime, some of which are kind of Soviet and date back to the Cheka, which was the sort of secret police founded by Lenin and by Felix Dzerzhinsky back in 1917, and some of which are kind of not Soviet at all, they're entirely different. But there is a tradition. I mean, the Soviet state and its Russian successor does have a long history of killing people it doesn't like. And when I was sort of writing my book, one of the there's this guy called Pavel Sudoplatov, who was the kind of KGB spy master, and his book in a way was a kind of a manual of how to do it. He was essentially sort of Stalin's sort of the head of his sort of secret police, and he was the one who was given the order by Stalin to kill various people, and then had to kind of translate it into action and write the operational plans, recruit the agents, and so on. And so Sudoplatov, for example, was the guy who organized the assassination of Trotsky. And he writes about this in his memoir about Stalin summoning him. He's quite funny about it, about the fact that Stalin would always use oblique language. He didn't say kill Trotsky. He said, you understand the political importance of your mission, which was a kind of Stalin bureaucratic way of saying kill Trotsky. So he did. I mean, he arranged the murder of Trotsky. He himself blew up a Ukrainian nationalist in Rotterdam in the 1930s using a box of exploding chocolates, which he gave to him, and left the cafe, and it blew up. Stalin was very pleased. And there's a sort of tradition of doing this, which also spreads to kind of operations in this country. I mean, I'm sure some of you may remember the murder of Georgy Markov, who was a Bulgarian playwright and dissident, who was walking along London Bridge in 1978 when he was famously poked with a kind of ricin-tipped umbrella and poisoned in an operation which was essentially Bulgarian but with KGB assistance. So there is a kind of tradition of this, but I mean, what I think is quite interesting about sort of Soviet state killing is the kind of ethical and inverted commas context, which is that Sudoplatov, writing this kind of memoir, basically justifies what he did in terms of the Soviet Union being engaged in a mortal struggle against its enemies, against fascism, against Nazis, against Hitler, against Ukrainian nationalists, and so on. And the way he kind of rationalized it to himself as the person who directed these operations was that the ends justified the means, and the ultimate goal, which was a kind of a fairer and more progressive state, was a sort of noble experiment that it was worth fighting for. But if you look at this trajectory, what happened was that after the Soviet collapse in the 1990s, with Boris Yeltsin, these killings largely stopped. If you exclude the first war in Chechnya between 94 and 96, essentially Kremlin enemies were not murdered. But what we sort of see by the time that Putin gets on the scene, he becomes president in 2000, is really this motif coming back, that suddenly opponents of the Kremlin, mainly domestic opponents of the Kremlin, have this kind of uncanny repeating habit of ending up dead in mysterious sort of circumstances which are never kind of properly illuminated. Now, we're talking about journalists. At least 23 journalists have been murdered in Russia since 2000. We're talking about human rights activists, including a friend of mine who was executed in Chechnya in 2008, someone called Natalia Estemirova. No one ever caught for her killing, and other kind of political opponents. And there's a sort of depressing pattern that has now become familiar to anyone who sort of follows Russia and writes about it, which is that someone is murdered, say like Anna Politkovskaya, who was murdered in October 2006, 3 weeks before Litvinenko. Essentially what happens is that no one is ever caught. An investigation, in inverted commas, is started. But if there are arrests, and usually there are not arrests, the people arrested and tried are kind of fall guys. They're Chechens, they're people at the bottom of the kind of logistics ladder, and those who order it are never ever arrested. And so, in a way, the Litvinenko case, for me, it was fascinating. Actually, there should be a photo of there, but he seems to have disappeared. I don't know if that's conspiracy or... yeah, okay, right, there he is. What made Litvinenko's murder different? He too was a kind of a massive and kind of remorseless critic of Vladimir Putin, and he wasn't a kind of he was a complicated guy, but was the kind of extraterritorial location. So Litvinenko, as you know, was murdered in central London in the Millennium Hotel in Grosvenor Square, and in Russia, what happens is the evidence can be made to appear or disappear. And so on. Whereas in Britain, what happened actually rather slowly was a kind of a genuine, dispassionate, evidence-driven kind of criminal inquiry by Scotland Yard, lasting almost a decade, as well as a kind of exhaustive scientific investigation into the circumstances of his death, which were truly strange. Now, this didn't lead to a criminal trial because the two killers, and I think probably we can call them killers now, Dmitry Koftin and Andrei Lugovoy, who are both ex-KGB, they are sitting safely in Moscow beyond the reach of British law, enjoying Putin's kind of patronage. But instead what we've had a public inquiry, which began in January of this year, and which I covered for The Guardian as a kind of reporter, chaired by a High Court judge, Sir Robert Ewen, running for 34 days of hearings, 10,000 pages of evidence, testimony from 62 witnesses, a couple of them anonymously, and really what it excavated was the secret material which had been collected by Scotland Yard and others, and had never previously been revealed. And it was really just sitting in the High Court, listening to this stuff, hair-raising detail that made me think I actually have to turn this into a book. So we actually, so Robert Ewen is going to report next month, and there are sort of two key questions that this public inquiry was examining. One of them is whether Litvinenko's sort of murder was a state assassination, and the other was to what degree we can say that Putin was personally responsible for doing it. And I'm certain that it'll be that Sir Robert will conclude that it was a Russian state plot. And the reason, I mean, there were various kind of details, but the most compelling is simply polonium itself. And if you look at this photo, you see this kind of forbidding beige building in southwest Moscow, which has got a very kind of anonymous name, the FSB Research Institute. But actually, what it is it's the Kremlin's poisons factory. It's called a research institute, but it's a poisons factory in a long tradition of poisons factory. The first one, set up by Lenin in 1917, was called Lab X, which is a bit more of a sexy title than the FSB Research Institute. But in essence, this was part of a kind of complicated logistical operation involving both Russian state agencies and state facilities. And we know the trail. So the polonium started off in a secret nuclear complex called Mayak in the Urals, named. It actually came from a reactor called Ludmilla, as in Ruslana Ludmilla. It was named after a Pushkin poem. I mean, I don't know if anyone knows the Pushkin poem, but anyway, so it started off in a reactor named after a Pushkin poem. It was then irradiated, transported to another location, which was Sarov, a place called Avangard, where there's a polonium production line, the only one in the world. And then, basically, it was taken to this place, we think, the FSB Research Institute in Moscow, where it was converted into soluble form and into a form in which Lugovoy and Koftin could take with them to Moscow. And there's evidence as well that polonium was kind of road tested on other people inside Russia before it was deployed in London in 2006, including on a Chechen prisoner who was given it in a cup of tea inside Lefortovo prison, which is the FSB detention centre, and was dead within a matter of days. So the inquiry heard that basically this was the perfect murder weapon. It was viewed by the Kremlin as was their kind of, almost like the sort of Prada of poisons, that it was invisible, it was tiny, it was easy to transport, and completely undetectable because it's an alpha emitter. So if you run a Geiger counter over it, you get nothing at all. And they even had a code word for it. They called it chemistry. So there were lots of chat about chemistry. So when I was in Moscow, I actually have to say I kind of, the Guardian sent me there at the worst possible moment. I arrived 2 months after Litvinenko had been murdered, at a time when Anglo-Russian relations were absolutely in a deep freezer, and it was not the best moment to be a British correspondent. But I did sort of pursue this story just because it was kind of very, very important, and I ended up meeting the two killers. You see, there's Kofton on the left and Lugovoy on the right. And they're kind of intriguing. And again, there are differences between the Soviet Union and contemporary Russia. One of them is that the assassins were a lot worse than modern. The KGB assassins used to be pretty kind of familiarly well trained. Kofton on the left is a former dishwasher in Hamburg. And Lugovoy had a slightly starrier career. He was a sort of Kremlin bodyguard, and did security for Boris Berezovsky's sort of TV channel, and was kind of, we think, recruited to do this operation. And one of the people I interviewed to try and pursue this story some time ago was Olga Krishtanovskaya, who is a sociologist, a kind of expert on Russian elite politics. And I went to go and see her in her kind of suburban flat on the outskirts of Moscow, and she told me that she has very good contacts inside the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB, which basically did all this. And she told me that the people in the FSB were basically acknowledging, yes, Litvinenko was their operation. Their only regret was not that Litvinenko had been killed. They felt he deserved that. He was a traitor. He deserved to be murdered. Their regret was the messy way in which it was done. And they basically said that things were much better when Yuri Andropov, who was the head of the Politburo and who ran the Soviet Union in the 1980s, was in charge, basically. So, third-rate assassins. And this photo was taken, this again came out of the public inquiry, this was taken by a constable at Gatwick Airport who saw these two Russians disembarking from the plane on their way to London on the 16th of October 2006, and he thought there was something fishy about them. So he stopped them. We think they were actually carrying the polonium at the time. He stopped them, he interviewed them, he asked them questions, he said they were very evasive in their answers, he checked their paperwork, and then he took this photo. In the end, he couldn't find any compelling reason to detain or arrest them. He checked the security services database, nothing, and they were allowed to go forward. And hours later, we have this. They meet Alexander Litvinenko under the guise of sort of luring him to a kind of business meeting in Mayfair, in Grosvenor Street. So if you look at the top, this is the office of a due diligence firm called Erinis. What's below there is a Scotland Yard computer model made after the event by taking radiation readings from the room and then sort of mapping them onto a 3D graphic. And essentially, this is my point about them being kind of sub-KGB killers. They simply, we think, they just put the polonium in his tea or glass of water sitting in front of him. And you can see where that was. It's the purple patch. Basically, they were testing for radiation, and they got off the scale readings here where it's purple. And the plan didn't work because Litvinenko didn't drink. So they put this poison in front of him. It had cost, we think, about $20 million for one dose. Russian resourcing being what it is, Kremlin resourcing, and he didn't drink. And he basically threw out that evening because of the kind of close exposure to this stuff. But he survived. And what happened next, again, which is why this story is so incredible, is that they failed. They realized that, but instead of kind of, somehow rallying back to the center in Moscow, they went on a joyride. So they basically tipped the excess polonium down the plug hole of their hotel bathroom, this $20 million poison. They went drinking. Lugavoy smoked shisha pipe. They took a rickshaw around Soho with a Polish driver. And then they visited Jojo's, which was an erotic nightclub, and spent time there. And we know all this because subsequently the forensic teams came around and plotted their movements to the second everywhere. 8 days later, Lugavoy comes back on his own and has another go. And for some reason we don't know this, the second attempt was in the Sheraton Hotel in Piccadilly, and he aborted the operation. We don't know why. And this time he chucked the polonium down the sink again and he mopped it up with his towel. And 2 months later, again this came out of the inquiry, Scotland Yard found the towel at the bottom of the hotel laundry chute with a whole cascade of other towels. And it's the most radioactive towel in history. I mean, it's the single most radioactive thing they found from their entire inquiry. I mean, it was just that the scientists who found it had to kind of retreat. Basically, it was so toxic. So yeah, there they are. You can see them. That's Lugavoy on the left and Coughton on the right, giving one of many interviews, including to me, protesting their innocence and saying that they'd been fitted up. Basically, they had nothing to do with this murder. But I mean, I think what's interesting, again, just to kind of bring out the differences between Russia and the Soviet Union, is with Sudoplotov that the aim was to kill enemies, to build the great society. And I think, essentially here, there were entirely different motives for killing Litvinenko. He'd been in Britain since 2000. So this is 6 years later that suddenly there's this sudden, frantic, bungling operation to kill him on the streets of London. But basically, Lugavoy had been in conflict with Putin for a long time. Sorry, Litvinenko had been in conflict with Putin for a long time. And in 1998, when he was head of the FSB, Putin fired Litvinenko. There's a whole kind of acrimonious backstory between them. He spent some time in prison. And then he managed to escape to the UK, where he kind of reinvented himself as a journalist and a writer. And I think, what's interesting is that Litvinenko was more or less the first person in his sort of public writings to say that what had happened in kind of 21st century Russia was that the communist ideology, if you like, which had defined the Soviet Union, had gone. And essentially what had replaced it was a criminal ideology, where essentially kind of the state was being run along kind of criminal lines for the private benefit of a small group of people. In this case, people who were friends of Putin's and who had known Putin either from East Germany, where Putin was stationed as a KGB spy in the 1980s, or from 1990s in Leningrad and then St. Petersburg. When Putin was working as an aide to Anatoly Sobchak. And I think Litvinenko was right. I mean, funny, I did another book called Mafia State based on what was said in kind of WikiLeaks cables, but this thesis, which at the time seemed pretty outlandish, is now kind of widely accepted, but Litvinenko was the first to articulate it. And there was one other kind of compelling reason to kill Litvinenko, which was that he was secretly working for MI6 and had been recruited in 2003. Had been recruited in 2003 as a kind of expert consultant on the Russian mafia. He got a handler called Martin. I don't think Martin was the real name of the MI6 agent, but he got an encrypted phone and he got £2,000 a month. And we saw Litvinenko's bank statements in the inquiry. And you could see the money from MI6 coming in and appearing on the bank statement next to the shopping from Waitrose and nights out at Nando's in Finchley. I mean, it's really, again, it's quite surrealistic to sort of see it. But I think the main reason he was murdered was that he was investigating the links in Spain at the behest of Spanish intelligence and British intelligence between the Russian mafia and top people at the top of Russian power. And essentially, he was disrupting money laundering schemes, and I had become kind of very, very embarrassing. So this, 1st of November 2006, they finally succeed, third time lucky, with famously a sort of cup of radioactive tea in the Pine Bar of the Millennium Hotel. But the detail, again, that we got this year is quite haunting. I'll show you why. So Litvinenko meets Lugovoy and Kofton at 4 o'clock in the Millennium Hotel. This is 3:30. This is the CCTV cameras again, which were secret for 8 years. We finally got them. So that is Lugovoy going to the gents' toilets of the Millennium Hotel half an hour before, and we don't know. But if you look at the left hand, he's obviously concealing something. And what we do know is that Kofton went to the same toilets 5 minutes later, and when there were forensic tests done of the left-hand cubicle, they found off-the-scale radiation readings. In other words, the two of them had been kind of readying this murder in the gents, and then meet Litvinenko half an hour later in the Pine Bar. And they give him green tea. He takes 3 or 4 sips. He ingests about 26.5 micrograms of polonium, which is enough to kill anybody, many, many times over. And the kind of most dramatic new evidence I think that we got in this case came from Litvinenko himself. So he fell violently ill. He was admitted to Barnet Hospital. Then within a week, 10 days, he was in intensive care in UCL. And 3 days before he died, 2 Scotland Yard officers appeared at his bedside. Oh yeah, that's the teapot, by the way. And amazingly, the teapot was put in the dishwasher and then served to other customers subsequently. I don't know if anyone was in the Millennium Hotel around that period, but that's it, that white ceramic teapot. And you can see the full-scale deflection is you can see on the spout as well, where it was. So Litvinenko is dying in hospital, and he talks to Scotland Yard, and he was himself a kind of former investigator, and reading the transcripts, there are 18 hours of tapes. It's just fascinating because he's cogent, amazingly cogent in the circumstances. He gives these kind of rather graphic pocketbook sketches of the people he thinks have poisoned him. He gets them right, the 2 Russians essentially. And he also blames Putin for his death, and is even thinking about the political angles, about how Tony Blair at the time, might react, how other G8 leaders should deal with this kind of, what is in his view is a kind of rogue state. And then 24 hours after the last peace interview, he goes into a coma, and then he dies on the 23rd. And so we have all of this evidence. This is one of the most documented murder cases in history. The only thing that we are missing are MI6's files. They haven't been released at all. I don't know if there's anyone here from MI6 who might help with that, but well, come and see me afterwards. But I actually, funnily enough, I did bump into Nigel Inkster, who was the deputy director of MI6 at the time, and I said, "Look, Nigel, there's any chance I might get these files?" And he was quite polite. He just said, "We haven't declassified anything since 1909." So I think that was a no. And the other thing we haven't got the government's own files. The William Hague, Theresa May, actually, who's here last term, have been very clear about not declassifying anything at all, although it has fed into the inquiry. The judge has seen it. Just sort of wrapping up. So, I mean, I think this is the 21st century, and yet there are still world leaders who are kind of murdering their enemies extraterritorially. And I think in part, Litvinenko kind of flows from Putin's view of the world. And really, he genuinely believes that everything can be negotiated, that everything has a price, and if it can't be negotiated, that it's some kind of conspiracy. And he also believes that Western politicians are as venal and greedy as their kind of Russian counterparts, and that these kind of peccant methods work. And actually, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he's kind of right or semi-right. I mean, the Kremlin has hired Gerhard Schröder, the former German Chancellor. Silvio Berlusconi bought the World Cup. That was one of the stories I was investigating when I got kicked out of Russia in 2011. And really, the estrangement between London and Moscow was driven by the fact that Putin wanted very badly to extradite Boris Berezovsky, his big enemy, back to Moscow, called up Tony Blair and asked him to arrange this with the judge. And Tony Blair explained that you couldn't call a judge in Britain and order a verdict. And Putin, who, like other people in the Soviet leadership, very much does mirror thinking, didn't interpret this as a kind of independent judicial process. He interpreted it as a personal snub from Tony Blair. So I would say that I think Russia today is a kind of it's a nimble, smart, adaptive, postmodern, authoritarian state, which I think since Putin's third presidency, which began in 2012, is really shading towards dictatorship. And there are 2 key projects. The first project we all know about because we watch the news, which is a kind of noisy, public project, a kind of nationalist project, a great Russia project, which is to, in a way, kind of restore Russia as a kind of co-equal superpower with the United States, assert its primacy in areas like the Middle East and Syria, in Ukraine, where we've had a war, and the annexation of Crimea. But the other project, which actually, in my view, is the more important project for Putin and co., is to steal money and to essentially steal state assets, to hang on to them and to legalize them in the West. And this has been a wildly successful project. That Putin and his friends are really about the richest people on the planet. They and now their sons and daughters are multi-billionaires. And I think despite the Cold War atmospherics of the last couple of years, we need to kind of follow the money. And that's something I and The Guardian and others are working on at the moment. And just very lastly, just a couple of words about propaganda. Doing this case, actually, after the CPS charged Lugovoy in 2007 with murder, he called a press conference at Interfax in Moscow, and he basically said that Tony Blair had done it, that the CIA had done it, the MI6 had done it, the Chechens had done it, that Boris Berezovsky had done it. And it seemed like lunacy, but actually it was part of a kind of another sort of postmodern Kremlin technique, which is to try and confuse everybody, so that actually you no longer know what is true and what is not true, and you can kind of, the truth can kind of slip away, if you like. It's a sort of, it's quite a clever strategy. So I would say that sort of traditional conceptual models of Russia don't work at the moment. I think it's a kind of, it's a fascinating country. It's a unique state which has got Soviet elements, but also has fused them with kind of crony capitalism and corporatism. I would say it's the world's foremost kind of informational power. Spent last year $1.1 billion on propaganda and on state mass media, including Russia Today. It's run essentially on behalf of a very small group of people. There are 110 billionaires in Russia who own 35% of the economy. So it's kind of neo-feudal. And I think it's vulnerable. I think it's a rather fragile place, which is vulnerable to US sanctions. Actually, at some point there will be another revolution, but I think it will be a while. But I am confident that when this kind of next Russian revolution happens, and I think it's probably maybe 15, 20 years off, I think that the secrets of the Putin era, including the few bits of the Litvinenko story that were missing, but much else, will come out, as with Sudoplatov. Sudoplatov was writing in the 1990s about the crimes of the Stalin era, what had happened 50 years earlier. We may not be around to see it, but I think it will come out. And in the meantime, I think kind of, scholars and historians and journalists and students of international affairs will have to, assemble the truth the best they can, which is what I've tried to do this year. Thank you.